relationship or the dialogue between them?
They're both. This is not collective history versus the other. Objects of War would be personal, because Objects of War deals with personal stories in relation to a potential collective history. And in the same way here, I use text by different authors and photographs in quite a subjective manner. I mean, even my selection of the text is very personal. So, do you want to wait or? So even my selection altogether is quite personal. And actually the object I was just telling you about, the sculpture of the sniper, I named it Object of War, and sort of to create an association, because both deal with this idea that this relation to a trace of the war, this relation to the potential for fiction that a trace can have, but also the trace of the whole as a relic or a remain of that moment. And Objects of War, the video and the object project, which I started in '99, the objects in this project act as relics. And they're also a trigger for stories that become potentially also fiction. I mean, it's about storytelling. I'm not saying that they're fiction. They are, of course, the testimonies that are very personal. But the borderline between what's the story and how do you recount it and what's the actual facts is very, fluid.
And I like, what do you think that with the much larger array of sources of documentation now, and like so many different ways of archiving, and just like, it's not like when there was very few documents and archives to resort to. Now there are multiple histories being created of any single event. How do you see that affecting collective histories in Beirut, for example, where I'm sure that there's also that richness or diversity, or sometimes it's too much even when one event is over-documented.
Yes and no, because it's true that with the new technologies you have a flood of images and potential archive. And in Lebanon, well, for instance, the museum project underwriting Beirut Mathaf is based on my inaccessibility to the archive of the museum. I was not given access to anything. Not to the archive, not to the library, not to the storage. I was only given access to the visible objects, and the only object that was not yet displayed to the public was the Good Shepherd's mosaic. So I was not given access to the archive, and actually even the notion of archive is quite special. If you think, there are two or three sources that I use regularly: the Arab Image Foundation, which is an artist-based project, the Fouad Debast collection, which is a very small archive of postcards mainly of Beirut, and Nahar newspaper, some newspaper which is very much like photographs that were, photographers that were embedded with the newspaper and were like so more with a journalistic approach. So it's not like we don't have access to every event, and you must know that in Lebanon there is no, of course there are facts that are easily accessible through newspaper and these archives, but there is no common sense of history, there is no common sense of consensual sense of identity or history. So it makes things, it makes even the use of archive and your own perception and subjectivity even more emphasized. And of course, with a probably bigger responsibility with the way you deal with this material, but also with more, gives you also more freedom, because there is hardly any reference or
But I mean, now that there's current events are being documented so thoroughly all over the world, is there still that even slightly fictional fear of disappearance and forgetting?
Yeah, I think probably not, because everything is documented. So the question is, what do you do with it now? Like, for instance, I've been mainly dealing with the past events of the Lebanese wars in my work. I have filmed enormously the event that happened since 2005-2006, the many demonstrations that were called the Cedars Revolution. I've never used them because I still haven't found the right way to use them. Knowing that there were hundreds of other, there were televisions, there were mobile phones, there were cameras filming the same event, I haven't found yet the right way to use them. So my response to that is just to wait for an idea and an approach that would be interesting to these. I have started to work on the present day Beirut. And the way I work with it is, I'm working now on a feature film called And the Living is Easy, where I use improvisation and non-professional actor to sort of get a sense of the daily life of Beirut without integrating necessarily the past, but where at some point some of the events of the past erupt in the dialogue or etc. And that film will be punctuated at some point with images from the news or like of what's happening what was happening in 2011 in Egypt, in Libya, etc., in Syria. And this will be almost like a punctuation of almost like reality moment, erupting through a computer or a television or a device that is an interface. But the film itself is filmed with this almost like feeling that nothing is happening, that precisely nothing is happening, that there's a stagnation where you feel that in Beirut today, if you come, you think that you don't see what has shaken the region around you.
Okay.